This evening, we would like to speak about a very important subject. It might sound that it's a tremendous chiddush that we're saying, but so we're going to see that the emes, in truth, this is exactly the message of the Chazal, of blessed memory, which they try to convey. So we're dealing with Parshas Shemot. The Ramban calls Sefer Shemot, Sefer HaGeula. This is basically the Sefer, the book of the redemption. Klal Yisrael finds themselves quite suddenly in a disaster, in a catastrophe, that they have now become enslaved and afflicted by the Egyptians. The entire nation has now become enslaved. The title of our shir, after we have this brief introduction, is indisputably the greatest generation in history. The Jewish people in Shibud Mitzrayim, in the subjugation, the inhuman affliction that they had to suffer in Mitzrayim, undoubtedly, perhaps even indisputably, were the greatest generation of all time, not just in Jewish history, but basically speaking in world history. That which the Jewish people became enslaved in Mitzrayim, of course, is not a chiddush. It's not something, even though it took place quite suddenly, there was a sudden disaster that occurred to the Jewish people. Nevertheless, it wasn't an event that was totally unexpected. It did not take them totally by surprise, or better to say, it was not shocking, because already many hundreds of years earlier, in the Bris Bein Absarim, the covenant which HaKadosh Baruch Hu established with Avram Avinu, which basically speaking is the very foundation of the Jewish nation, because we descend from Avram Avinu. So in this covenant, HaKadosh Baruch Hu already told Avram Avinu clear and distinct terms, Ki ger yeh zaracha be'eretz lo lohem ve'avodum ve'inu oisam arba me'ah shana. Even though I gave you Eretz Yisrael, that's your homeland, it's muchzekes to the Jewish people. It's under their title and presumptive ownership from the time of Avram Avinu, like our sages have told us. Nevertheless, they will be in exile. Your children will be in exile in a land which is not theirs, and they will be afflicted and subjugated for 400 years. The selection of Am Yisrael, of the Jewish people as the chosen people, which ultimately will be established with the giving of the Torah, but beforehand will only be realized through the travail, suffering, and affliction in the course of 400 years. This was the information given to Avram Avinu. And after sorrows and miseries that your children will have to endure during that duration of time, only then will they go forth, b'rechush gadol, with a great inheritance. Of course, that refers to Matan Torah. Yet Kaviyachol redeemed Bnei Yisrael after 210 years, as the Chazal state on the pasuk in Shir HaShirim, Kol doidi zebo medalig aloharim mekabet al agvoyis. This is supposed to be understood metaphorically. Kol doidi, that refers to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So he skipped 190 years, and the Jewish people were only there 210 years. The reason we're speaking about this section before we get to the main topic of the shir is because this is necessary to place in proper perspective how it is that the Jewish people in Mitzrayim achieved the most dizzying heights, and they reached the proportion of being indisputably the greatest generation and generations of all time. So we see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Avram Avinu 400 years, and at the end they were only there Redushanim 210 years. What exactly is responsible for this reduction? So there's many answers. However, the Ravid in Hilchos Tshuva, he's from the outstanding Rishonim. In the years 1200, he lived in Provence in France. So he basically asked this question, and he says the following in Hilchos Tshuva, the Perek Vav, the 6th chapter, Halacha Hey, Ki abayre omal v'avodim v'inu eisam dalet me'or shana. HaKadosh Baruch Hu decreed that the Jewish people should be afflicted and subjugated for no more than 400 years. But however, the Mitzrayim did above and beyond what HaKadosh Baruch Hu decreed. And they actually murdered, massacred the Jewish people. Little children were drowned in the Nile River. This was not Bechlal the Gezerah. This was not Bechlal the decree. The decree was not that the Jewish people should be murdered. No massacre, says the Ravid, was included in divine decree. This is something which they undertook due to their Bechira Chavshus, their freedom of choice. Everybody has freedom of will, and they exceeded the measure of affliction and torture manyfold, and therefore they were punished. I basically designated a little bit of affliction, and they undertook it should be mass destruction, annihilation, and totally trying to destroy with a diabolical plan the Jewish people. So therefore, that 400-year decree, due to Koshia Shibud, the intensity of the Shibud, the intensity of subjugation, equals 400. 210 qualitatively equals 400. Quantitatively, 210 does not equal 400. However, insofar as the decree of 400 years of affliction is concerned, so from a qualitative point of view, 210 years equals 400 years of normal affliction. And the subhuman cruelty that the Egyptians subjected Bnei Israel was indeed mashlim, completed the gezerah, the decree of 400 years. So the question naturally arises. This is the answer vis-a-vis the Jewish people. The process of purification and catharsis from all the defects of the Jewish soul, which should have taken normally 400 years, was accelerated by the Kura Barzel, by the blast furnace, which Mitzrayim is metaphorically compared, just like we have a Kura Barzel which purifies gold. It removes all the dross, it removes all the negative qualities. So through affliction, through torture, the Jewish people, the Nishmas Yisrael in the abstract sense, was purified through this catharsis process, and the 400 years that should have been the normal process was accelerated to 210 years because the Koshia Shibud. So this is the answer insofar as why 400 years was reduced to 210 years vis-a-vis the Jewish people. However, there's another question which is not usually asked. In other words, we heard this question from an old Zaidi of ours, and we heard an answer to this question from the same Zaidi that we had, that he heard it from the Chidush Sharim, which was not printed. So we'll take this opportunity to relate to our very, very outstanding and noble viewers the question. The question is a very simple question because in the Bris Bein Absarim, we have another clause. And that clause is very, very simple. The destination of Klal Yisrael from Mitzrayim was, of course, Eretz Yisrael. So after 210 years, they were now supposed to come back to Eretz Yisrael. It was the return of the exiles from Egypt. It took another 40 years, so they came back after 250 years. However, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Avraham Avinu emphatically that the reason that the Jewish people will have to be in Egypt for 400 years is not only because of the tikkun, the moral, ethical catharsis that the Jewish people have to go through, which will take 400 years, but there's another reason. And we can't really say it's a secondary reason. There's another primary reason why the original decree was for 400 years. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Avraham Avinu emphatically that he will not drive out the Amori and the other 7 nations that now inhabited Eretz Canaan until the completion of 400 years. Why? Because we do not banish, said HaKadosh Baruch Hu, 7 nations who inhabited Eretz Canaan until they are simply not deserving of being in Eretz Canaan. They're simply not deserving of staying here any longer. They deserve to be exiled and banished. And this will take 400 years of transgressions and sins. And Rashi says it black on white. Why? HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not punish a nation that Rashi says until the amount of sins and transgressions has not been reached. It's as if there was a measurement of a certain amount of averos, chatoyim, transgressions, which the Zion Amimim had to commit in order to precipitate the banishment from Eretz Yisrael. And the Rashbam adds, Adar is 100 years. That's what it says in Maseches Idias, it's 100 years. Tadar Revi means 400 years. Why 400 years? So we have another primary reason, because the Jewish people, that's the first reason, have to undergo a process of catharsis, which will take 400 years. That was achieved, accelerated in 210 years because of the immense torture, murder that the Jewish people were the object of by the Mitzrayim. And another reason is simply because we cannot have the Jewish people return to the homeland till after 400 years of sins that are committed by the Zion Amimim, by the 7 nations. So this is the question. And the truth of the matter is, no one disputes this, that after 250 years, the Jewish people came back to Eretz Yisrael. So what happened to an entire clause of the Bris Bein Absarim? A very difficult question. And the Mefarshim, the basic commentators, somehow or other, do not ask this question. It's a very good question. So as I said a moment ago, it was transmitted to us the answer. And the answer was heard from the Chidushei Arim many years ago. He was the first Grand Rabbi of Ger. So this goes back to the early 1800s. So the Chidushei Arim, the great Chidushei Arim said, the Zion Amim, the 7 nations that inhabited Eretz Canaan at that time, so indeed they were Shemot, they were neighbors with Egypt. And we mentioned a moment ago, the Egyptians committed such great atrocities with cruelty and brutality that was unheard of from the 6 days of creation. And yet, all of these 7 nations, as the Chazal point out indirectly, were totally indifferent and apathetic and stood by silently without protesting against the utterly evil, egregious actions of the Egyptians, who engaged, as we said a moment ago, in the worst type of Koshei Hashiba, the worst type of affliction possible. So the Chidushei Arim says we have a new formulation. Just like the Koshei Hashiba, the intensity of the affliction was mashlim, completed the 400 years in 210 years, because qualitatively it equaled 400 years to 210 years of torture and affliction. Likewise, the Koshei Hashiba is also an answer for the Goyim. Also, their Chatoyim, their Averis, their transgressions and their crimes against humanity were also accelerated from 400 years to 210 years. What was responsible for this acceleration? For this qualitative crime that they committed? It was their total silence. When they saw such rishis like the Nazis, so this accelerated, intensified their chatoyim, their ledger of sins, to the extent that in 210 years, it became sholem, completed Avonei Moiri. It's as if in 210 years, they committed sins, egregious sins, that would take normally 400 years to commit. Their tacit endorsement of evil personified in what the Chazal say, if somebody witnesses a crime, he witnesses evil action, and he remains silent, so it's a proof that it's good. He agrees with it. He approves of it. And he would do it himself if he could. It's the greatest indication in the face of evil, silent man. What is the indication of silent man? A complete seal of approval. And that took 210 years. So it's the exact same principle that's responsible for the Avonei Moiri to be banished after 210 years, and in actuality 250 years from Eretz Yisrael. They lost their permit. They no longer can stay in the Holy Land. And it's interesting, very interesting, that the Gemara, when it speaks about Hovanes Chachmaloi, right, that's the Gemara in Soita. So the Gemara in Soita tells us something very, very remarkable. That the Gemara in Soita tells us that there were 3 people that were involved in Hovanes Chachmaloi. When the Jewish people became a little bit too much for Paro and the Mitzrayim to handle, so he said, Hovanes Chachmaloi, let's come up with some sort of diabolical plan to stop their increase in the land of Egypt. They're increasing at a very rapid pace, and we have to try to stop this because otherwise we'll be in danger in case there'll be a war. So they'll join up with the enemy. So in order to concoct some sort of plan to stop this natural increase of the Jewish people, so 3 people were present with Paro. That's what the Chazal tell us in Daf Yud Aleph in Soita. Amar Reb Chia bar Rabba, Amar Rabbi Simoy, Shloisha Yeboy Soyetza, Biloim Iyai Yisrael. And it's interesting, what was their destiny? Biloim Shiyoat. So Biloim said, Kol ben Ayiloi Loicha Tashlichu, any son, any male child that's born should be cast into the river. So what was the Midah connected Midah? What was his punishment? He also was killed. Iyov, Job, Sheshosak, Nidem B'Yisurin. But we have a sefer Iyov that tells us of all the tragedies, calamities that occurred to Iyov. What was the reason for it? Because he was silent. Yisrael Sheborach, Yisrael ran away. So his children were Zeicha to sit Belishkas Hagozis of his descendants. So his descendants became members of the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court of 71 that sat next to the Beis HaMikdash. Their chambers were located next to the Beis HaMikdash in Har HaBayis in Yerushalayim. So the Shebina Rav, of course, asked the obvious question. What was the great sin, the great crime that Iyov committed? There was no way Paro would change his mind after he heard from Bilam what should be the advice in order to stop the natural increase of the Jewish people, and the proof that nothing can be done to change his mind was simply Yisrael had to distance himself by running away. So Iyov did not distance himself. He did not run away. He stood there and he was silent. So if Iyov did not protest or demonstrate by distancing himself from the Eitzah, as Yisrael did, but remained silent, so why was he so severely punished? Because when it comes to silence in the face of evil, it's a betrayal of total moral values. A total betrayal of moral values. And as we said a moment ago, it's an indication of a seal of approval. So therefore, he was punished with Yisur. Said the Shebina Rav, when somebody endures pain and suffering, he cries out. So we'll ask him a question, said the Shebina, is there any benefit in your crying out? You're shrieking, you're screaming. Oi, oi, it hurts, it hurts. Is there any benefit in that expression? Does something basically remedial come out from screaming? Of course not. So why do you scream? The answer is because it hurts. And if you're hurt and you suffer, you get hurt and you suffer, you feel the pain, excruciating pain. So it's part of nature that you express it by screaming. It doesn't do any good. But at least we understand, right, that you feel this pain, excruciating pain. And that is exactly why HaKadosh Baruch Hu punished him with Yisur. Now you scream. Why? Why you scream now? Because you're suffering. How come you didn't scream then and protest and demonstrate? Because you weren't suffering. You agreed with it. You approved of this diabolical plan. And of course, we know, my father used to tell me that during World War II, we know that many, many countries not only passively stood by in silence while the Nazis committed such atrocities, it wasn't simply a passive type of response. In other words, they didn't stand passively and did nothing, but like the times of Paro, Zayin Amamim, like the Chiddush HaRim said, but in World War II, so we know for sure that many, many countries abetted, helped out the Nazis to commit the terrible crimes against the Jewish people and against humanity, which they committed. And we have this documented that they actively supported money-wise, also in different ways. They supported the extermination of the entire Jewish people in Europe. And my father told me we really faced the mortal danger of total extinction, in total. And as we know, that Mashiach Tzidkenu will only come when the Goyim are kulei chayiv, when all the Goyim are going to be sinners. And there's no question in that department of kulei chayiv, my father used to say, so the Goyim became extremely, extremely enriched, more than ever, and we're closer to the ultimate redemption than we were ever before. At this point, we should like to go back to the original topic of discussion. It might sound novel, but there's no question, according to the Chazal, that in this crucible of affliction and suffering, in the Kaishi Hashiva that we mentioned a moment ago, we see the most remarkable hallmark, the most salient feature of the great Jewish nation. The Gemara in Saita, Daf Yud Beis, relates as following. As soon as Paroi, the evil person, decreed, based on the advice and counsel of Bilam, that every male child should be killed, and every female should live. Of course, that was also part of Bilam's diabolical plan. When they would grow up, who would they marry? Egyptians. So that would surely bring about a total assimilation and a destruction of the entire Jewish people. The males would be killed, females would be allowed to live. They would want to get married, or even if they would not want to get married, they would be forced to marry Egyptians, and that would be the end of the Jewish people through assimilation. So the Gadol Ador at that time, says the Gemara, was Amram, the father of Moshe. Gadol Ador Hoya, he was the great leader of that generation. So what did he say? He said, Lashov vanu amelim, for naught we are working. In other words, our entire efforts are for naught, because if we continue having children, so the males will be destroyed, only females will exist, and those females, unfortunately, will become assimilated with the society of the Egyptians, and ultimately all Jewish identity will be lost forever. So what did he do? He divorced his wife Yocheved. Since he was the Gadol Adar, he was the leader, so all the Jewish people followed him, and every single Jew who was married divorced his wife. What was the Yesod, the foundation which he based this on? Lashov onu amelim, our endeavors and our undertakings are for naught. Nothing's going to come out of it. Only a disaster. So according to the tradition, Miriam was 3 years old at the time, and she said, my dear father, your decree is worse than Paroi. In other words, you're a bigger Rasha than Paroi. Because Paroi was only geyser death on the males. And you're also being geyser, you're also decreeing on the males and the females. Paroi gozar ela boilam hazeh. Paroi's Seir was only in this world. We have to understand this. Va'ata boilam hazeh u'olam habo. Your decree carries weight not only in this world but in the world to come. Number 3, Paroi sofek miskayemes. Paroi's decree could be HaKadosh Baruch Hu will, after a certain amount of time, have compassion and it will be canceled. But your decree will not be canceled because you're the Gadol Hador, you're the outstanding leader, and everybody is a follower, and they will not exactly desist from following your example. So this is straightforward, this Gemara. And the Gemara said that he was convinced that Miriam was right. And what did he do? He remarried his wife, had children, Moshe Rabbeinu, who came from the remarriage of Amram and Yocheved. Lekuchim Shniyim, who was the second marriage, same wife, but it was the second marriage. And everybody else also remarried. And the Gezerah was implemented. The Jewish people, if they had a male, was drowned in the river. Rashi, when he explains what does it mean that Miriam said that your geyser also in Olam Haba, what does that mean? What's the relevance of Olam Haba within this context? So Rashi says as following, that the decree of Amram is worse since it affects Olam Haba as well. So Rashi explains, when a mother gives birth to a Jewish child, and if this Jewish child happens to be a baby boy, says Rashi, afterwards Paroi comes and drowns him in the yard, drowns him in the river. The baby boy is immediately Zoicha, merits to reach the world to come, paradise. Why? Why? So Rashi says, because he passed through this world. And even if he passes through this world for an hour, even for a minute, so he has a tekuma, he will have a great, great future in Olam Haba. And those are the words of Rashi. Paroi legazel b'olam hazeh. Paroi's decree was only in this world. Shenoilodim, they're born, umesim, and they die. Could be for a minute, could be for an hour, could be for a day. The chayzrim, but nevertheless, they're resurrected. The chayinein lo'olam haba, they live in the world to come. Ato gazarta b'olam hazeh, b'olam haba. But you have now made a decree by not allowing, simply preventing neshamis from the olam neshamis, Jewish souls, from that world, from entering Olam Haba, the hereafter, the paradise of hereafter. Because Kivan Sheina Leilodim, if they're not born, they don't come into this world, they don't pass into this world, they will not merit the ultimate Olam Haba, the greatest of all rewards. Therefore, the drowned babies will live again in the thereafter. Unborn children that are in the neshamis, and they're from the olam neshamis, from the world of souls, are denied this supreme blessing of olam haba. So we see, interestingly, that the first avodah Hashem, that Klal Yisrael undertook in such bitter conditions and under such bitter decrees, was, as the Gemara states after Miriam's argument, Omad Amram v'hechzer esishtoi, Amram remarried his wife, and Omdu Kula v'hechzer esishtoi, everybody remarried, despite the decree. And the decree was being enforced by the military and by the police, and was for many, many years. So after Miriam's argument, Klal Yisrael realized what Amram realized right away, that his explanation, Lashav Onu Amelim, all of our endeavors are for naught, is wrong. It's not correct. On the contrary, even if we should only bring babies into this world, and immediately the babies will be cast into the sea and they will be drowned, it's worth it. It's not Lashav Onu Amelim. It's not in vain do we labor. That's the literal translation. That was the motto of Amram, not to have children, because in vain we are laboring. Lashav Onu Amelim. No. Miriam explained to him, you have a mistake. We labor for a higher purpose. We labor for a real tachlis. So the Jewish people in Mitzrayim realized very strongly that as soon as one brings a purpose into this world, he is automatically, he builds worlds and worlds in other worlds. And the drowned babies will merit Olam Haba, as will the parents. Because Miriam's motto was L'tachlis Onu Amelim, we are laboring for a higher purpose. Despite the fact that Bnei Yisrael were in a bleak, dark, shiftless existence, Miriam explained that God forbid we should not stop from doing the true tachlis activities, true meaningful, purposeful activities. Because if we do, we'll be totally lost. And here we have a tremendously deep insight into how Klal Yisrael existed all those 210 years. During all types of affliction and suffering, their basic and fundamental inner awareness revolved around the unique awareness of meaning and purposefulness in life. And the Jewish people came to the recognition that very few generations ever came close to, that despite the difficulties and the torture of bringing little children into the world and seeing them snatched from their mother's bosom and cast into a river and drowned in front of their own eyes, is a purposeful undertaking. We don't bring children into the world for our own sake. We bring it because this is the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And in these circumstances, they understood that God's will to bring the Shemus from the Olam HaNeshamas into this world in order that these Neshamas, should realize and reach Olam Haba, the supreme blessing that any Jewish soul can reach. Unbelievable heroism, unbelievable courage, unbelievable negation of any vestige of egoism, bringing children in for our own sake that we should have, even though there's a lot of lishma involved. We want children to go in the Jewish way. But under these circumstances, where they're under tremendous danger of being exterminated, so there was an act of sacrificial altruism that was simply not matched in other generations. So this, no question about it, was one of the greatest generations, and perhaps, my opinion, undisputedly the greatest generation of all time. And in mysticism, we start what they call Shevavim. We'll speak about that another time. Shevavim is a time that all of us through self-introspection, should try to undertake actions and activities that are only purposeful and meaningful insofar as it will hopefully help us reach Olam Haba. Thank you very much to all our viewers and all our listeners. All the best. Chaya Sprung signing off from Yerushalayim. We love you all and we wish you Kol Mili Demeitav, every single good quality in Gashmias and materialism and Ruchnias and spiritualism.